Well, good morning, everyone. It is so good to see you this Friday morning. Thank you so much for joining us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And today we'll be landing on Hebrews chapter 9. And today we're going to try and keep things really short and sweet, but that I want you to be able to, or I want us to use this time to wrap our minds around at least two features that figure prominently in a chapter like chapter 9. And indeed, you could probably say if these two concepts actually figure prominently in the book of Hebrews as a whole, and that as we're reading through the book of Hebrews, it's helping us try and wrap our minds around in what ways Christ is indeed clearly superior than Moses, than the angels, than the old high priests, the old covenant, that the author is wanting us to look at Jesus and in what ways he is clearly superior because he is the real deal. Indeed, he fulfills what was in so many ways, in so many way in which that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament, that what we see in the Old Testament, in the sacrificial system, the Levitical priesthood, Moses, etc., are really just shadows of what is to come and what is to be fulfilled in Jesus. So there's at least two things that I want us to wrap our minds around, or at least wrestle with as we come to a passage like Hebrews chapter 9. The first one is being that of covenant, and the second being that of sacrifice, which are two concepts that figure prominently throughout the Old Testament, and it's only insofar as you can grasp their meaning and their significance within the Old Testament are we really able to grasp what it is that Christ has done, and how it is that his work upon the cross in establishing a new covenant and his sacrifice dealing with our sins actually makes sense, and that we can see clearly what it is that Christ has done and how important that is and how it makes a difference in your life and in my life. So in the first place, go ahead. I would encourage you, if you haven't already, do read through Hebrews chapter 9. If not, we'll just be focusing really primarily on only just a handful of verses today. I want us to read through. This is Hebrews chapter 9. This is verse 15. And it says, "For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant." It's worth noting, this is the sort of verse where the writer suggests to us, or encourages us to see in what ways the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross has the power to actually deal with sins that are in the past. And that's an encouraging thought to me, because maybe your past, like my past, is filled with a lot of sin and a lot of things that I'm ashamed of. But the work of Christ addresses those very things. But one of the things that I want us to bear in mind as we're reading through a book like Hebrews is that what Christ accomplishes on the cross is to bring us into covenantal fellowship with the living God, which I think for some of us is something maybe a little bit abstract, and if it's not abstract, is something a little bit, I don't know if frightening is the right word, but just actually maybe in some measure sometimes undesirable, particularly as we as a culture or as a people, I think, are increasingly afraid of commitment within relationships. In other words, that we continue within our relationships because we're bound by a covenant to them. Hence, I think probably one of the reasons why it's easier for many of my peers to cohabitate with their boyfriends or girlfriends and never really want to commit, because when there's a covenant commitment, that means there's covenant accountability and a cost that's afforded when you engage in a relationship like that, when you bind yourselves together in covenant fidelity. Sometimes I think it's easy to forget that what Christ accomplishes through the cross in dealing with our sins and making it possible to have relationship with God, that when God bids us and calls us to relationship with him, the nature of that relationship is one of covenant. God rescues us and deals with our sin so that we can walk in faithfulness and wholehearted devotion and love towards God above all things. It's all important for all of us to remember that when God calls us, when he rescues us, when he deals with our sin, he calls us into covenant fellowship with him. But secondly, the issue of sacrifice that really does figure prominently in a chapter like Hebrews chapter 9. Let's look at a verse. It's actually quite a famous, perhaps well-known verse in Hebrews. This is Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22. It says, "In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood." If we're reflecting on the purification of the priests and the temple instruments back in Leviticus, you know that everything that has to be marked and cleansed with blood. And which is weird for us to think, because when we get blood on something, we think that we have to get it off to make it cleansed. But in light of Leviticus, it's the blood itself that actually cleanses. It's the cleansing agent, or the purification, the thing that makes this sort of thing holy. When we start talking about blood and sacrifice and cleansing, we realize that we're in a way of speaking and understanding that is really just foreign to most of us modern readers. And it forces us to have to go and think in the terms that most of the ancient readers understood well, and understood much better than we do. And so, but let's finish. And it says this: "And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." Let's repeat that. "And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." Now that's a startling statement for me when I think about how it is that blood, the shedding of blood through sacrifice, that is substitutionary atonement, that's the thing that has to be in place in order for there ever to be forgiveness of sins. And perhaps you, like me, have read passages like this and just wondered to yourself, why is it that blood and blood shed through sacrifice in substitutionary atonement, why is this thing necessary in order to bring about forgiveness? And I want to try and simplify, maybe even probably oversimplify these sort of things, this complicated matter for you, just so that we can at least begin to try and wrap our minds around this. That wherever it is that you see the sacrifice of an animal in the Old Testament and its giving of its blood, it is symbolic, at the very least, symbolic of that animal giving its life, surrendering its life, so that somebody else can live, or something else can live. This is the thing, a way of understanding and thinking that is self-evident. It even goes without being said throughout the ancient world. That is, when something else dies, whether it's an animal or plants or whatever, that thing dies and you eat it. So that means this thing dies so that you can live. Whenever it is that blood is involved, it symbolizes in what way or to what extent that that by virtue of somebody or something else dying, it dies, it gives its life so that your life can continue. That's what we mean by substitutionary atonement. That is, somebody has died the death that you deserved so that you can live on. This is the thing that I think is still pretty foreign, even to those of us who have been raised in a Christian family, in a Christian home, in a Christian environment, to remember that sin, the sin that you and I are both guilty of, even unconscious sin, is sin that brings death, and it brings separation from God. And that until somebody else dies our death in our place, we don't have any kind of hope for life, indeed everlasting life, and reconciliation with God. It's because of Christ's work, indeed his completed work of what it is that he has done, that animal sacrifice is no longer necessary, because his work and his sacrifice of his blood and his death means that by virtue of his death, that means you and I can actually live. And I think even as Christians, that reality is a thing that just so oftentimes gets forgotten or becomes so familiar that we begin to treat it as something trite or treat it with contempt. I would encourage you, as you're reading through Hebrews, take note on in what ways Christ's sacrifice was indeed superior, in that it accomplishes what the sacrifice of animals could never accomplish. Not only to the extent that it actually deals with our sins, but that it does so in a way that is complete and it's final, that sacrifice doesn't have to continue on in order for us to have a right relationship with God. What it is that Christ has accomplished is enough. And I pray that it's enough for you and it's enough for me. And that because we believe that it's enough, that we will hold fast to Christ and fix our eyes on him today. So thank you so much for taking the time to have daily devotions with us. Encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get daily notifications. And I pray God would bless you. And I pray that you and I would walk in covenant faithfulness with God, and that we would never, ever forget that our blessing of walking in covenant fellowship with God is made possible and only possible through the perfect and complete and finished work of Christ and his sacrifice that deals with our sins and our alienation with God. So God bless you. God keep you. And I pray that God's absolute best for you today, and indeed in the days and years and the time to come. So take care.